everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Michaela and I am the president of the Sisterhood, and we're in for a real treat tonight with Deborah Corber. Deborah has dedicated her career to the advancement of reconciliation for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous Canadians. So who else could introduce Deborah but somebody who knows her very well, her daughter Jordana. So I'm going to pass it over to Jordana to introduce Deborah. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and Deborah will answer them at the end. So take it away, Jordana.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jordana, otherwise known as Jory, and I'm Deborah's daughter. My first thought when I was asked to introduce my mom tonight was, wow, there's nobody else I'd rather speak about. Shortly followed by, how am I going to possibly capture everything I want to say in 5 minutes? I assure you I will keep it short. Many of you likely know my mom through her work in the field of Indigenous affairs, which would have brought you here tonight, or from her time as CEO of Federation CJA. What you may not know is that she actually began on a very different trajectory, receiving a bachelor's degree in classical piano performance at McGill. Though music was and will always be one of her loves in life, she ultimately chose a different professional path when she decided to go to law school at Osgoode Hall, and then pursued a master's in comparative constitutional and human rights law at Columbia. In my opinion, this change of course into human rights allowed her to chase another one of her great passions, the pursuit of equality and reconciliation. After 5 years in Toronto and another year in New York, she accepted a job as legal counsel in what was then called the Native Law section of the Department of Justice, and she moved to Ottawa. She worked for the Department of Justice for close to 14 years, working on files such as the Charlottetown Accord, which I've heard her reminisce about fondly my whole life. Although she worked for the Canadian government, it was always abundantly clear where her heart lay, which explains why my 9-year-old self asked her why she always referred to Canada as her boss when she clearly worked for the First Nations. She ultimately moved back to Montreal with me and my dad, and eventually began working on her own as a consultant in the same field. In 2011, she took a slight career detour when she accepted the role of CEO at Federation CJA. She made a significant impact in our very own community during her time in that role, but speaking as her daughter, I can honestly say that her return to the field of Indigenous affairs in 2018 felt like her coming home. That same year, she founded her consulting practice, Corber Consulting, and began working tirelessly on the Trans Mountain Pipeline project, where she led consultations of 45 First Nations with the goal of accommodating impacts of the pipeline on Aboriginal and treaty rights. Following that, she received a ministerial appointment as Chief Federal Negotiator and is currently leading self-government and land claim negotiations with the Manitoba Métis Federation in that capacity. As you can probably tell, I'm a very proud daughter and have always been inspired by my mother's career. That said, like most people, when I think of my mom, I think of a lot more than her career. Most people who meet her can likely attest to her bubbly demeanor, her intellect, and how well she speaks. I'm doing my best to come even remotely close. But those close to her can attest to her generosity and huge heart, stopping at no end to make her family and friends happy, building bridges between everyone around her, and caring so deeply for people from all walks of life and for causes all over the world. She is endlessly optimistic, most of the time, often reminding me of her favorite quote that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, and speaking hopefully about the positive changes she believes that my generation will make. She is fundamentally curious and interested in the world, constantly reading, learning, and challenging her own views. If any of you have her on Facebook or have somehow peeked into my family group chat, then you're aware of her attempts to share any knowledge or train of thought, which comes from her genuine excitement to pass along information and opinions that she found valuable. I could go on a lot longer, but I don't want to take away from the main event. So to sum up, I'm a very lucky girl to have her for a mom, friend, and role model. Thank you.
Well, I'm not really sure how I'm going to follow that. But I shall try. So good evening, everybody. First, my sincere thanks to Michaela Meltzer, president of the Shaar Sisterhood, and her partners in crime tonight, Robin Bennett, director of community engagement, and Susan Greenspoon Zemmel, creative director. And while I'm at it, a special shout out to Rabbi Shaar, Penny Kolb, and the entire Shaar team for doing such an extraordinary job. I'm sure everyone will agree, keeping us feeling connected and cared for throughout this pandemic. I very much appreciate the invitation to speak with you all this evening. Having my daughter introduce me was a late-breaking surprise and is a very special delight, as you can imagine. She's a little bit biased, so you may have to discount her comments a little bit, but I love her to the moon and back, and thank you, sweetie. I must admit that I found the title An Evening with Deborah Corber a little bit intimidating, but in the end, it was hard to pass up an opportunity to talk with you about this important topic, which is very dear to my heart. So I managed to get over the title. I've tried to break my remarks this evening into two parts. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about my path and some key lessons that I've learned along the way. And then I'm going to share some thoughts around reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians. And I've tried to leave some time for discussion because that's way more fun than simply listening to myself talk, and because I always learn through people's questions. So first, my path and some key lessons. So yes, the Shaar Bulletin says that I dedicated my career to the advancement of reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians, but full disclosure, all of the roles that I have played in this capacity, providing legal advice, developing policy, facilitating and negotiating, have all been on behalf of the federal government. So I want to disabuse anybody of any notions that I'm somehow a crusader. I am not. Nor am I a social scientist. It sounds a little bit like an oxymoron, but I really think of myself as a pragmatic idealist, a lawyer who thinks about how to use the law, develop policy, and negotiate agreements that get us just a little bit closer to reconciliation. I actually fell into the field by accident, as Jory mentioned. I had planned to be a concert pianist, but realized towards the end of my studies at McGill that a life in performance would be precarious, and I didn't really have that sense of destiny that you need to succeed as a performer. So I went to law school instead. I loved ideas, I cared about justice, and I was apparently a born talker who liked to argue, so it seemed like a good fit. I was in first year law when our Constitution was repatriated in 1982, and Canada got its first constitutionally protected Bill of Rights, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Although I was more interested at the time in sexy rights like freedom of expression and religion, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and equality rights, the new Constitution also recognized for the very first time that Indigenous peoples had protected rights that could no longer be taken away at will. And that was really momentous. I finished law school, articled in Toronto, got called to the Ontario bar, and then decided that I wasn't quite done with school yet. So as Jory also mentioned, I did a master's of law at Columbia, and it was really there that I fell in love with constitutional and human rights law. Toward the end of my program, like many Canadians pursuing graduate studies in the US, I was recruited by the Toronto office of Blake's, which was then Canada's largest law firm. They did a great pitch, but I just couldn't get excited about the idea of a traditional law practice, even at a top-notch firm. So I turned them down without any other possibilities on the horizon, convinced that I wanted to work on human rights for the Canadian government. I think my parents were a little confused by my thinking. Why choose government over the private sector? And why choose Ottawa over Montreal or Toronto? But they welcomed me back home anyway to figure out next steps. I think they were secretly a little worried that it would be hard to meet a nice Jewish boy in a small town like Ottawa. But as it turns out, I found a career and a Jewish husband in Ottawa, although he's not from Ottawa, but that's another story. After 6 months of job hunting, eating cookies, and feeling mildly sorry for myself, I finally got an offer, ironically from a nice Jewish boy originally from Montreal, who happens to be Marilyn Bloomer's nephew, just a little Jewish geography, to join what was then called the Native Law Unit of Department of Justice, and the rest, as they say, is history. When I look back on it now, I realize what an exciting time it was to join the government. Aboriginal law as a discipline was young and relatively unexplored, and Canada was just 2 years away from Meech Lake, followed by the Charlottetown Accord. For a constitutional law nerd like me, this was heaven. So here we are 30 plus years later, and I have to say that I have learned more from working with Indigenous people than I could ever have imagined. Tonight, I'm going to just share 3 key lessons because I could go on for hours about what they have taught me. First, I've learned that to understand people of different backgrounds, cultures, and perspectives takes a different kind of listening. Those who know me will tell you that I'm basically an impatient person, that I love to talk, that I think and talk too quickly for my own good, and that if you give me just a nanosecond, and maybe even if you don't, I'm likely to jump in and finish your sentence for you. These traits are not the Indigenous way. Patience and respect for others are core values across all Indigenous nations and cultures. And I can honestly say, I don't think I've ever been interrupted by an Indigenous person, even when they reject everything coming out of my mouth. We have different communication styles too, whereas we tend to be linear when we speak, moving from one point to the next until we get to our destination. Indigenous speakers tend to be more thematic in their approach. You need to really listen for key themes and messages to get the essence of what's being communicated, and to avoid the temptation to jump too quickly to where you think the conclusion is going to be. So while I'm fundamentally still pretty impatient, I have learned how to slow myself down, particularly at the negotiating table, and to listen more acutely to an Indigenous speaker. That includes getting comfortable with the silence between thoughts. It's what I like to call hearing between the notes. I'm still working though on putting those skills into practice in my personal life, but I digress. Second big lesson. I've learned that if you show people genuine respect, even when you disagree vehemently with them, you can usually find ways to bridge the gaps between you. We hear a lot about the importance of tolerance, but tolerance is not the same as respect. Nobody wants to be just tolerated. We all want to be seen and heard and to have our essential human dignity respected. In my experience, when you show respect to the people across the table, you open the door to meaningful conversation, and you really increase the chances of solving problems. Now, this is likely true for any human interaction, but when you represent the government of Canada, the very government that's been responsible for so much pain, there's a lot of baggage in the room. Showing respect, the kind of respect that's been lacking for so much of Canadian history, makes a huge difference in every single conversation. I've learned that we have a great deal to learn from Indigenous people, likely way more than we realize. We are inundated with negative stories about Indigenous communities, about dysfunction, about conflict, about claims for hundreds of millions of dollars that take forever to resolve. And when you live in a big city like Montreal, you can go through life never meeting Indigenous people unless to see those vulnerable people congregating around Cabot Square and the Alexis Neon Plaza. But this really leaves us with an impoverished view, because we don't get to see Indigenous strength and resilience, Indigenous knowledge, talent, creativity, and yes, a growing Indigenous desire to partner with non-Indigenous Canadians and institutions to solve problems and build a better country. I'd like to share a little story. As Jory mentioned, I helped to lead consultations with First Nations on the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project. So I spent the better part of 6 months, 2018 to 19 in BC, getting to know First Nations all across Vancouver Island and some in the Fraser River Valley on the mainland. And one of the key themes was that First Nations were terrified about the possibility of an oil spill. Their communities have relied on fishing for millennia for their survival. They have a spiritual relationship with the killer whales that live in the Salish Sea. They have sacred burial grounds along the coast of Vancouver Island that would be the first casualty of a spill. But oil spills are what we call high-risk, low-probability events, likely to happen only once every 120 years, so low probability, but devastating when they occur, so high risk, kind of like global pandemics. I spent a day in one Vancouver Island community that was vehemently opposed to the TMX project going forward. It felt like we wouldn't be able to agree on anything, not the project going ahead, not the mitigation measures that Canada was proposing. And at the end of that day, an Indigenous elder stood up and looked me squarely in the eye and said very quietly, when that oil spill happens, because it will, we don't want to be standing on the beach saying, we told you so. We want to be standing there alongside you and saying, okay, now let's get to work cleaning this mess up. This First Nation, despite their fundamental opposition to the project, wanted desperately to be part of the solution in the event of an environmental disaster. Ian Anderson, the president of Trans Mountain, told me not to waste my time with them because they were never going to support the project. But Canada doesn't have the luxury of ignoring communities just because they don't agree with us. We need to partner on finding solutions wherever we can, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the smart thing to do. Indigenous peoples are not a monolith. There are 634 First Nation communities in Canada, which represent more than 50 nations and 50 Indigenous languages. There are Inuit peoples and Métis peoples. But whatever their history, language, or culture, all Indigenous peoples care deeply about protecting the natural environment. It has sustained them throughout history, and it's interwoven with their spirituality. At the forefront of all their decisions is thinking about the next 7 generations. I sometimes wonder what our world would be like if non-Indigenous societies cared even a fraction as much about the planet and about the legacy we are leaving to future generations. Something to think about. So, talked a little bit about my path, told you the 3 most important lessons that I've learned, and now I'm going to move to talk about reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians. It's a big word, reconciliation, and it's probably an overused word. It means different things to different people. On its face, reconciliation can seem simple, as in, we've had a bad history, we have some reckoning to do, let's just sit down and work it out. But it's a really, really complex undertaking that mixes law, policy, and politics, and really continues to bedevil federal and provincial governments alike. So I'm going to share some insights and try to demystify a few issues for you. And hopefully the conversation will help you to navigate current events and maybe inspire you to take a little more interest in the area. But first, a few baseline facts. As of the 2016 census, 1.7 million people self-identified as Indigenous. This includes about 980,000 First Nations people, 587 plus thousand Métis, and 65,000 Inuit. So roughly 60% First Nation, 35% Métis, 4% Inuit. Altogether, the Indigenous population represents only 4.9% of the total Canadian population. Fewer than half of First Nations people live on reserves. The balance live in villages, towns, and cities across the country. The Indigenous population is young and the fastest growing part of the Canadian population. Our aging population means that this young Indigenous population will be key to our future economic growth. And finally, I'm sure you know this, but it bears repeating, that Indigenous people fare worse than non-Indigenous Canadians on virtually every socioeconomic indicator, most notably in health, in education, employment, and income. So there's some baseline facts. And before I move to insights, I want to say very clearly and unequivocally that I see reconciliation as an absolute imperative for Canada. It's not a nice to have, it's a need to have. And I say this for 3 reasons. First, because terrible harm was historically done to indigenous peoples, and because justice demands that we redress that harm. Doing justice is also a distinctly Jewish value that we learn from Deuteronomy, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue. Second, because harm continues to be done to this day, albeit in different forms, and there's just no justification for that in one of the wealthiest, most peaceful countries in the world. And third, because there's a lost opportunity cost if we don't achieve reconciliation. Canada needs the contributions of thriving indigenous communities and indigenous individuals who have the same opportunities as the rest of us to succeed. Now, of course, the biggest responsibility for achieving reconciliation falls to Canadian governments, federal and provincial. Only governments can redress the historic harms and eliminate systemic discrimination. Industry, universities, the philanthropic sector can help to close the wide socioeconomic gaps, but the lion's share of the work still falls to governments. So, why is this taking so long, and when will we finally be done? The short answer is it's taking long because it's hard and enormously complicated, and because we can't impose solutions on Indigenous peoples. We need to develop them together, and co-development takes time, particularly when you consider the vastly different circumstances and capacities of Indigenous communities across Canada. Here are some of the big challenges. 1, hundreds of years of colonialism cannot be reversed in a few decades. The legacy of residential schools is profound, and the pain and dysfunction in many communities will take 1 or more generations from now to overcome. 2, outdated legislation. So most First Nations continue to be governed by the Indian Act, which is an anachronistic, paternalistic, and frankly racist piece of legislation that everybody agrees needs to go. Problem is, we can't seem to agree on what should replace it. First Nations have dramatically different needs and realities. The Mohawks of Ganawage across the Mercier Bridge are thousands strong. Their kids go to school with kids from Chattagee, and they have very sophisticated governance systems. They also have an interesting economy, but that's for another conversation. Ganawage is nothing like the hundreds of small, remote, poor Indigenous communities in Ontario or BC or many other parts of the country. So 634 First Nations don't agree on how to replace this terrible legislation, and Canada won't change it unilaterally because that would violate our commitments to develop solutions with First Nations rather than imposing them on First Nations. And it should be pretty obvious that all the imposition we've done over the past couple of hundreds of years hasn't worked out that great anyway, so certainly better to co-develop. Third, systemic discrimination. It exists in law enforcement, in healthcare, in employment, and many other areas. For the purposes of this talk, let me just say that the evidence of systemic discrimination, the kind of discrimination that is hardwired into systems and cultures, is overwhelming. Premier Legault and other leaders as well, but Legault is the one that I seem to be preoccupied with these days. He may not want to acknowledge systemic discrimination because the Quebecois narrative is that they're victims of the English, and victims of discrimination don't discriminate against others. Beside the fact that, I think two things can be true at the same time. You cannot fix what you won't name. So systemic discrimination, as long as we resist calling it that, will continue, in my view, to be a serious impediment to reconciliation. 4, quality of life versus legal rights. So when I began in 1988, we debated which should come first. What we called bread and butter issues, that's quality of life issues like addressing poverty, clean drinking water, social dysfunction, educational attainment, economic opportunity, or legal rights like recognizing rights, settling land claims, and negotiating self-government agreements. Well, it turns out we have to do both, and they're actually two sides of the same coin. For example, You can't just throw money at a community to fix their water treatment plant. Infrastructure needs to be built, it needs to be operated, and it needs to be maintained. That takes a community government with the capacity to regulate and oversee the operation. And that community government needs to have recognized legal authority to do its job properly. It's all interconnected. Fifth, redressing historic wrongs. So redressing historic wrongs is a legal, sometimes constitutional obligation for governments. We settle land claims because we have a legal obligation to compensate Indigenous people for lands that were stolen and rights that were violated. We negotiate self-government arrangements because Indigenous peoples have a constitutional right to govern themselves. And it's really better for both sides if they do that according to negotiated arrangements rather than unilaterally. To reach these agreements, Canada needs to be ready to share power and share resources, something we don't do easily. Governments need incentives to share, which usually means one of two things: court decisions forcing them to act, or a crisis, like the Wet'suwet'en dispute in BC last year, which halted the Coastal GasLink pipeline project and led to blockades across the country. That certainly got our attention because it created a major inconvenience for us. But making decisions in crisis mode doesn't always yield the best results. And personally, it's another discussion, but I think the jury's out on the decisions that were made last year. Even with incentives, settling land claims is a huge challenge. At the same time, it's a great opportunity to help First Nations become self-sufficient because the sums involved are enormous. Working out the details, though, can take literally decades. Canada won't expropriate lands from people who own them today in order to compensate Indigenous people for lands taken in the 18th or 19th century. So if you can't give the land back, you need to provide different kinds of compensation for the loss. And negotiating those deals takes years, even decades. It takes an army of experts, lawyers, historians, policy experts, accountants calculating lost opportunity costs. And that exercise itself costs a small fortune and takes time. 6, resource development is a divisive issue. Indigenous people are quite divided over issues of resource development, whether to participate in it or try to stop it. They want to protect the environment, yes, but they also want a more equitable share of Canada's rich natural resources, which can help to secure their future. The good news here is that resource extraction industries like oil and gas, mining, hydroelectric power development are spending millions to work with Indigenous communities to mitigate the negative effects of development projects, to provide jobs for Indigenous people, and to provide a share of the profits. And these industry Indigenous partnerships can deliver greater benefits more quickly than many government programs and policies. In fact, if you go online and you look up any of these natural resource companies, the big ones, you will for sure find that they all have departments that deal with relationships with Indigenous communities. 7, negotiating self-government. So this is where I spend a lot of my time. Self-government is about sharing power more equitably and more effectively. So where 150 plus years of federal and provincial governance was paternalistic, discriminatory, and hugely ineffective, the idea is to recognize that First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities can govern themselves on matters that are internal to them. But that means weaving Indigenous lawmaking power into an existing constitutional framework that, on paper at least, only provides for federal and provincial lawmaking. So working out who has the power, how conflicts between different laws get resolved, and who pays for it all can take many, many years. So when will it all be done? Well, the answers vary from hopefully within the next few years all the way to probably never. Let's take ensuring that all communities have clean drinking water. This government has made big strides, but they haven't met their targets and the work is ongoing. I hope and expect that this will be done within the next few years. Narrowing the gaps between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous Canadians will likely take decades more. And it will take longer than that if governments keep insisting that systemic discrimination doesn't exist. There are not an infinite number of land claims. They're probably a finite number, although I've never tried to add them all up. But settling them is tough for the reasons I alluded to and for all kinds of legal reasons that I won't bore you with tonight. Even with adequate resources and lots of creativity, I'm sure that we still have decades of negotiations ahead of us. And on self-government, I don't see these discussions ever being done. The federal government doesn't hand over equalization payments to the provinces and say, have a nice life. This is fundamentally about intergovernmental relations and arrangements, and those by definition are ongoing. So Indigenous governments will need to be integrated into our federal system of government, and that means lots more ongoing work. I'm going to wind down my remarks after I take a little bit more water with some thoughts on the title of this talk. Reconciliation is not just for governments. What can we do to learn more? As I tried to outline tonight, the heaviest lifting is the work of federal and provincial governments. But prioritizing something like reconciliation generally happens when the courts order you to, when a crisis forces you to, or when voters insist that you do. We're all voters. If we don't think something's important, governments have less incentive to act. I would like to see all of us hold our governments to account for doing the work and making the investments to compensate for centuries of harm to Indigenous peoples and to erase the appalling gap in life chances between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. To do this, we need to be informed and we need to care. And I think the two go hand in hand. It's hard to be indifferent when you think about the incalculable harm, the evil really, of tearing 150,000 First Nation children away from their parents, placing them in residential boarding schools where they were routinely subjected to physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, and then returned to their communities as broken teenagers, all in the name, by the way, of Canada's official policy of, quote, killing the Indian in the child. It's hard to be indifferent when you read, as I did this past weekend, that at least 160 girls and women were killed in Canada last year by people who knew them, and a quarter of them were Indigenous, even though the Indigenous population makes up barely 5% of the Canadian population. Similarly, it's hard to ignore the fact that over 26% of the inmates in federal prisons are Indigenous, once again, while Indigenous people make up barely 5% of the overall population. It's hard to be indifferent to a story about an Inuit woman, this is a couple of years old, post-surgery, bandaged with an IV hanging from her arm, who went missing after she was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, thrown in jail to dry out, and then released by the police at midnight in East End Industrial Montreal with nothing but a bus ticket in her pocket and no ability to speak French. One thing that's not hard, because we can access just about anything online, is to become better informed citizens. Now, most people don't have the time or the bandwidth to read the reams of reports from 1984 to today. It's all documented for those who are interested. But if you are looking for something really easy to digest, I recommend a little book called 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. It's barely 100 pages, and it can be read in 1 or 2 sittings. I promise you, you will never look at Indigenous peoples or reconciliation the same way after reading that book. I recommend 2 terrific movies, both from 2017, both available for rent online, I checked. One is called Indian Horse. It's about hockey and residential schools. And these are dramas, they're not documentaries. The second one is called Hashomayim, Land of Souls, which is actually about Montreal from 750 years ago to the present. It's really terrific. There's even a reality TV show called First Contact. It has 2 seasons now. It takes 6 ordinary Canadians with negative attitudes about Indigenous people, on a 6-week immersive journey across the country. And you can see how it transforms them or not, but in most cases it does. Beyond holding governments to account, we can try to ensure that our children and grandchildren are properly educated about Indigenous peoples and history in this country. I learned nothing in school about Indigenous peoples. And Jory, who's 28, learned, I think, very little. Simply asking your schools about their curriculum in this area could be helpful. Let me close, because I've been talking for a while, by reminding you of a story that broke last fall about Joyce Echaquan, an Atikamekw mother of 7 who died in a Quebec hospital. The story was widely publicized. She filmed herself from her bed while she was in obvious distress and pleading for help. Toward the end of the video, which was streamed live, 2 female hospital staff enter her room and are heard making degrading comments, including calling her stupid and saying she'd be better off dead. When Nakuset, who is the executive director of Montreal's Native Women's Shelter, was asked to comment on this really scandalous story, she said she was hopeful that what happened to Echaquan could be a turning point for Canada, the way the death of George Floyd galvanized the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. Nakuset said there was still hope for change, but only if Canadians from all backgrounds demand it. The only way, she said, that we can make changes as a society is to show up, because actions speak louder than words. Thank you very much for listening.
Wow. Oh my God, that was amazing. Thank you so much. We have so much work to do as Canadian people. And you know what, it really reminded me of Australia, where I grew up, the same problem we have with the Aboriginal people there. And when I went to Central Australia with the kids, I took them there. It's all sacred land, and you learn from the Aborigines themselves, their stories. They have beautiful Dreamtime stories. You get such an appreciation being with them and understanding them. And I think you're right, we have so much work to do here. And it's education. I don't think my kids learned much at all at school about the Indigenous people at all. The only Indigenous people they see it, like you said, on Cabot Square are the drunk people. Mm-hmm. So that book, I think I'm going to get that book and read it. I would be really, really interested. I have a question for you. You said there were
634.
34. Okay. Mm-hmm. So all 634, do they have different customs, and in order to reconciliate, all 634 have to agree as well as the government?
So that's a great question. No, here's what I would say. So when we say First Nations, we're talking about really communities. And there are many First Nations very often that comprise one nation. So there are 50 nations. And when I think of a nation, the Mohawk Nation, the Cree Nation, the Algonquin Nation. These nations may have many First Nation communities that are part of that nation. So I think of Ganawage and Ganasatake, which some people know is located near Oka, and Akwesasne, and there are 6 nations. There are probably 6 or 7 Mohawk communities. They speak Mohawk. They have the same matrilineal forms of government. Their culture is very much shared, but they live in different areas. They have different reserve lands that they occupy and that they manage. So they can choose to come together and negotiate something as sort of a larger aggregate with the government. Depends how big they are. You know, in BC, you have communities that are First Nation communities. They could have 50 members or 200 members. They're tiny. But for them, it might make more sense to come together in a larger aggregate so that they have an economy of scale. And then, you know, you want to have a school board, you're not going to have a school board for 20 children. So it really depends, is the short answer.
Okay. Wow. I took a whole page of notes. I was writing down what you were saying. I was trying to, do we have any questions? So there's the book, there's the movie.
Something, yes, somebody said, Arlene Kay said, book Richard Wagamis. Yeah, well, I think he's the author of the book that forms the basis of the movie Indian Horse.
Okay.
It's really terrific. Anybody who loves hockey needs to see that.
Okay, I have to show my boys that. And I loved how you talked about the concept of listening and the different types of listening that we have, and that's a whole cultural thing. I know that we don't listen enough in our culture. We tend to talk over people and not listen. And I love that whole idea of respect just by listening. So you must have a lot of stories to tell about different communities that you've worked with. Any one that sticks out in your mind?
So actually, one of my favorite stories, I wanted to stick to my 30 minutes, so I didn't tell too many stories, but one of my favorite ones dates back to 2006. People may remember what was called the Caledonia crisis. That was a land dispute. Caledonia is a small town near Hamilton in Southern Ontario. And that was a land dispute that involved two factions of government in the Six Nations. Six Nations is the biggest, let's just say for the sake of keeping it simple, the biggest Mohawk community in Canada. They're probably, 10, 15,000.
Okay.
And they have an elected band council, which is a form of government that is a delegated form of government from this paternalistic Indian Act. And they have a traditional government, which are hereditary chiefs. So when people think about the news last year and the blockades around the wet sweat in BC, similar, not exactly the same. But anyway, the Haudenosaunee is the Iroquois Confederacy. They are the hereditary chiefs. And they're locked in a bit of a battle with the elected chiefs. This was the first negotiation where Canada, in probably, 150 years, sat across the table from not just the elected council, who were kind of like our people, because we've delegated their power and we hold the purse strings, we give them their money, and you get the picture, and the hereditary chiefs. And they each probably represented, in terms of where they get their legitimacy, maybe 50% of the community. It was Ontario at the table and Canada at the table. I was a legal advisor to the negotiator, the Haudenosaunee and the elected council, and they were barely speaking to each other. And it was really, really tense. People were in fatigues, and young guys coming in army fatigues and masked, and I had to control myself not to just say, "Oh, take off your mask and grow up." Really, 20-year-olds like trying to be intimidating. At any rate, the Mohawk governance tradition is matrilineal. So what that means is only the men get to serve in government, but the clan mothers, the women, I say the women hire and fire.
Okay.
So they groom the young, talented young men as they're growing up. They put them in positions of authority. If they screw up, they get demoted and replaced by the women. So you have to imagine the scene. You're sitting at this long, long table, Canada and Ontario on one side, and the two factions of governance for the Six Nations on the other side. And all of the clan mothers sitting in the row behind their spokespeople at the table. In my mind, I used to think of them as Mohawk bubbies. Okay. And really inscrutable. No expression on their faces. You just could not read them at all. Anyway, I was there every 2 weeks for a couple of days and stayed at this lovely, log cabin inn. And every night I had this crazy, stupid habit really of taking off my rings, and I put them on the vanity next to where I brush my teeth. It was a very, very tiny vanity, very, very tiny room. And when I got up one morning to go wash my face and brush my teeth, I of course knocked my engagement ring down the drain. I could feel my heart stop, and I looked down and I could see it at the bottom of the drain, but there was no trap door. There was no way for me to get this out. So I went to the owner of the inn, a Mohawk woman herself. She had a little laugh at my expense. She said, "Okay, we're going to have to break the pipe, but I'll get somebody here. We'll get it for you. I'll message you when we get it." So I went to the negotiations, and I was just not myself. And I think I have a pretty good poker face in negotiations. I'm told I do, but that day, clearly I did not. And I must have been like looking at my phone. I try not to do that in negotiations. And there was a break, and I went to the washroom, and one of these Mohawk bubbies came up to me. I'd never exchanged words with her, and said, "You look a little upset today, dear. Not like yourself." She said, "Dear, something wrong?" And I told her the story about the ring. Within about, 15 seconds, I was surrounded by, 10 or 12 of these Mohawk bubbies, these clan mothers, grandmothers. Everybody was talking about what they do with their jewelry at night. Do you take it off? I never take mine off. My finger's too swollen. I mean, it just went on and on about. And when we went back to the negotiations, I did eventually get the text from the owner of the inn that they had retrieved my ring, and felt better. Everything changed from that point forward. The inscrutable faces weren't inscrutable so much anymore, at least not to me. When we lined up to get our lunch or to have a coffee break, we would start to chat. And it seems like a really trivial, innocuous story, but that has replicated itself many, many times throughout the years for me. And it really just makes the point that people really, at the end of the day, we're all just people. And we may be looking for different things, and we bring different perspectives and life experiences to the table. But if you can find those everyday experiences and those feelings that we really all share, you can become human to one another. And that makes all the difference, really. One other very quick story in that same community. At the end of a very long, difficult negotiating session, one of the young activist Mohawk women, probably in her early 20s, really took me on. And she was very frustrated and very upset, and just sort of came at me as, "You don't understand, you don't know what it's like, and you live in your fancy whatever office," and wherever it was she thought I came from. And she went on. And at one point I just looked at her and I said, "I understand that you're very upset, but you really don't know me. You don't know anything about me. And the truth is that my ancestors fled Eastern Europe running from persecution. And I think the history of the Jewish people is one of the reasons, learning about that history and feeling that in my culture and my religion, is one of the reasons I want to do this kind of work. So no, I haven't walked in your shoes, but I really do care. And that's why I'm here." And several months later, she came up to tell me that she had been given the opportunity to go to the, I guess, Los Angeles, I think, has a Wiesenthal human rights center of some sort. I don't remember the name, but she was sent on a program. I don't know who sponsored it, must have been the government, but she went and she spent a week there learning about not only Jewish history and in particular the Holocaust, but learning about other genocides. And she came back, she was absolutely transformed, and had to tell me about this, and told me that she had wept when she was there, and that she was beginning to understand that her pain, wasn't worse than other people's pain, and it wasn't unique, and we embraced. And it was just one of those very sort of touching moments. So all of these exchanges, some of them are very intense and some of them are very kind of hostile, but there's always the possibility to create a bond. Yeah. And then all kinds of problem solving can start to happen.
Wow, that's amazing. Amazing.
I see somebody has written a question. What's the difference between Métis and indigenous? Great question. Okay, I should have said that at the beginning in my baseline facts. So indigenous is just sort of this broad pan word that means anybody who identifies as Aboriginal. It includes First Nation, which are people that we used to call Indians, but we don't use that term anymore. Métis and Inuit are also indigenous. So they're all indigenous. Métis are people who are descended from Louis Riel, actually. So these are the descendants of French and English settlers who married Cree and Ojibwe and other women, and they really gave birth to a nation. There is a Métis nation, Ontario, Manitoba, westward. and north, and a little bit into the US. They have their own language, which is called Michif, and it's a combination of Cree and French, and their own customs and culture and history. So and the Inuit are the people of the north.
It's so fascinating. It really is. And I can't imagine there's much that would intimidate you after years of doing this.
No, sometimes. Anyway, I actually, what I tell most people, and it's the God honest truth, is the toughest part of the job is dealing with Ottawa. It's really not at the table. It's hard because, politicians come into office and they make all kinds of promises, and I don't think, certainly in this field, which is the one I know most about, I don't think they fully appreciate what it is they are committing to.
Right.
And then they get into office and the civil servants tell them, oh, you thought you were going to do that, did you? So, and I think, there's a lot of talent in government, but government is inherently risk averse and not too keen on doing anything differently. And of course, every agreement is different because every community is different.
Yeah.
So that's a little more intimidating than the First Nations.
Are you hopeful? We're going to wrap it up, but are you hopeful for the future with the Indigenous people and their...
So I am hopeful for the future. And, I had to think about how to use my time tonight. There are a lot of really exciting, inspiring stories of things happening in the Indigenous world all across the country. There are extraordinary contributions to all of the arts. There are outstanding academics that are really starting to make their mark. I personally think that the next appointment to the Supreme Court of Canada should be an Indigenous jurist. I could think of like two off the top of my head who would be fabulous. They are a little bit slower, I think, to start really making their mark in the sciences. But they are doing extraordinary things. There is something, if anybody wants to Google it, that's really interesting called Indigenomics. It's an institute, a platform actually, that partners with Indigenous business people all across the country and is aiming for a $100 billion Indigenous economy within the next 10 to 20 years. And I think it's achievable. Lots of great economic contributions and a young population that just needs the tools to really, I think, become their best selves and to contribute in really critical ways to the strength of this great country.
Two questions, and then we'll wrap it up. How do we get out from under the Indian Act? That's one question.
Well, there's two ways to do it, and one way has so far proven very difficult, and that is to abolish it and replace it with something. I, a couple of years ago, facilitated a conversation of Indigenous people all across the country to try and talk about what we could do to get rid of it, and the only thing that was clear is that nobody could agree. So the other way to do it, which is probably the better way to do it, but will take time, is really just to kind of contract out of it. And that's what self-government negotiations do, essentially. Self-government with Métis is different because Métis aren't subject to the Indian Act, and the Inuit are not subject to the Indian Act. It just governs the 980,000 First Nations people, whether they live on reserve or not, and half of them don't live on reserve. And that's what we do, is we negotiate self-government agreements that then get legislatively protected by Canada, and then the Indian Act doesn't apply to them anymore. But when you asked me the question before, do you have to do it separately with 634 First Nations? Lord, I hope not, because that will really take forever. But for every self-government agreement that we can conclude, we can remove that community from the Indian Act, and the way they are governed and the way they govern themselves is replaced by the self-government arrangements that are negotiated, but that will take longer.
Okay, thank you. And are there books for very young children to sensitize them?
I'm sure that there are. That's a fabulous question. I'll tell you what, I would be very happy to look into that. And why don't I do this, Michaela? I will send you an email. I will write down the name of the book that I mentioned, 21 Things You Never Knew, the names of the movies, and see what else I can come up with on books for young children. And then for people who are interested, you know, you can email it to them.
Thank you. And on that note, I think your next chapter in your life is a book. I think you would have a book and stories and so much. I'm sure there would be so much that you could contribute, and then you could write music to play with it. Because do you still play the piano, and do you still do that?
So much to the dismay of my husband, my family generally, not very often. I do play sometimes, but the thing about it is, and anybody who has really mastered a physical skill, in particular sports, dance, playing an instrument, when you stop doing it intensively, you know, you lose your chops.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that people keep telling me, oh, it doesn't matter that it's not as good as it used to be, we still think it's great. To me, it's not great.
Yeah.
And, you know, I have to have 2 hours to be able to sit down and warm my fingers up, because that'll take at least an hour. And it's never quite what it once was. So I don't do it as often as I should. I keep saying in retirement. So.
Okay. Well, I started learning.
It's always around me, always.
Well, thank you so much. It was really, really a wonderful, informative hour. I know I learned a ton, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you, Jordana, as well, for introducing Mum. It was really, really lovely. Thank you so, so much. A quick reminder, tomorrow there's going to be a Pesach interactive program with the clergy, but you have to register online. So anyone who wants to do that, please go online. Thank you again. Chag Sameach. Have a lovely Pesach.
And thank you, Michaela, for the opportunity, really.
Oh,
and thank you, everybody, for listening. It's hard to listen for a long time.
There was over 60 people listening to you. So
thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.